Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me present to your campus and to the Heterodox Academy community. It's really a pleasure to be able to speak with you all today. My topic is what to know about ideological bias in psychological science and its clinical implications. And if you are interested in researching this topic more later, you may also know it by related terms such as political diversity or bias, viewpoint ideological diversity and bias. And so keep that in mind. The objectives for my presentation are: 1, to define the ideological problem presenting professional psychology; 2, to become familiar with the most important research studies; and 3, learn relevance of sociopolitical bias to and resources for professional practice. So the outline that I have, I will start with a brief background, a little bit of context about why I'm presenting on the subject matter, the problem as I best understand it, and a review of the central studies, as well as my current research projects and some commentary about professional applications before we have time for questions. So it was approximately in 2015 that I began this sort of falling down the rabbit hole, so to speak. I had just finished my coursework and my dissertation at my university and was soon beginning my doctoral internship when I started reading a great deal. It started with a book published by Christina Hoff Sommers, and it really called into question initially some of the ideological underpinnings in feminism that had been a part of my dissertation topic. And I realized that not everything I thought was indeed true was the case. Not only did I not realize, but multiple of my dissertation committee members were also unaware of the ideological underpinnings that I think resulted in not the most comprehensive dissertation project that I could have created, but without any sort of feedback or contrasting perspectives, this was unknown to me until I really delved into content that wasn't covered during my graduate training. And as a result, that has really motivated me to begin communicating concerns about ideological bias in psychology and to increase awareness, especially in clinical settings. So this is the problem as I best understand it. Essentially, there's a significant difference between the political makeup of professional psychology versus that of the lay population. And one thing to be aware of is much of the research explains the terms conservative and liberal and using that binary, especially in the American context. And it really does sort of reflect or coincide with the two-party political system that we have. So some of the language may seem a little bit awkward to those in Canada or the UK, but this is the best the best labels we have to understand the problem. You could understand liberal as meaning left wings, sort of perhaps more progressive, favoring large centralized government, welfare programs, social liberalism, wariness of free market capitalism, and sometimes conservative values relate more to tradition, maybe classical liberalism, sometimes libertarianism. But of course, these terms are multidimensional, so that is important to keep in mind. But to the second point here, cognitive biases tend to increase with with higher levels of education. And so concerns have been raised about the ideological blind spots that result from limited diversity, confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, and perhaps this is even compounded by the reality of the replication crisis. I believe that still needs to be explored more fully. But because of these concerns, there's consequences, and several of the ones I've noticed I've listed here. So they include certain research is promoted, even though it can be misleading, research that contradicts or refutes the overarching narratives is frequently ignored or disregarded. Research findings tend to be very predictable based on the ideological makeup of the profession, and that can also result in sort of negative public opinions of professional psychology. And this became most apparent a couple of years ago when the APA released its guidelines for boys and men, and there was considerable negative public opinion about that. There's a growing pattern of prospective therapy clients seeking ideologically neutral or objective providers, typically those possessing more moderate or conservative values, seeking providers who will at least be receptive or responsive to their needs. And there's also a professional concern for ideological statements becoming required for licensure, ethical good standing, hiring, and career advancement. Okay. And so speaking of the sort of disparity in ideological makeup, or the difference there compared to the lay population. So in this chart, this is one of the best representations we have of how this has changed over time. You can see here that the political party and ideological sympathies of academic psychologists have shifted leftwards over time. This graph depicts the ratio. Circles show ratios of self-reports of liberal versus conservatives, and diamonds show ratios of self-reports of party preference or voting patterns. So this is a conglomeration of several different studies, but over time you can see that the ratio has become more lopsided. And it depends on what type of psychologist group is surveyed and what type of criterion is being assessed, but some other ratios can be even more pronounced. For instance, 40-1, according to voting patterns in one study. And this is really significant because, at least according to a Gallup poll from 2014, granted a little bit older, but still for point of reference, they found that conservatives made up 35 to 40% of the population, moderates 34 to 38, and liberals 19 to 23 of the population in the United States. And so granted, maybe the political makeup may have shifted a little bit by 2022, but the political makeup in professional psychology is really sharply different. So what I'd like to do is walk through a series of studies that were particularly formative in my development and the sort of process by which I really became more conscious of the ideological bias. And I'll cover them in a particular order, starting with the two most well-known ones, and then transitioning to several topic areas before winding down with ones related to clinical practice. So perhaps the biggest publication on this topic was that of Duarte et al. In 2015. This was a large literature review and review of the problem of ideological bias, specifically in the social psychology realm. And this publication essentially entailed a target article that outlined a lot of the concerns sort of listed here, the latent ideological assumptions in professional psychology, the scope and direction of bias, stereotype accuracy, confirmation bias, differences in ability and interests, and so on. And in true heterodox fashion, the target article was followed by several dozen responses from other psychologists in and around North America, really internationally, and some agreed with, some disagreed with the premises in the target article, but it is really perhaps the most comprehensive publication and essentially linchpin to further publications by others. The recommendations they outlined, though, included, but are not limited to, adopting anti-discrimination policies, conducting studies of barriers and obstacles to non-liberal students and training programs, expanding diversity statements, and so on. The next primary study is that of Inbar and Lammers in 2012, and essentially what they sought to do was understand why professional psychology is skewed left of center. And there were a couple of running hypotheses at the time, for instance, self-selection, along the lines of birds of a feather type of grouping, personality factors, but one hypothesis was that of a hostile climate and discrimination, and they wanted to explore whether or not that was a valid hypothesis. And so they surveyed 800 social and personality psychologists and found that only 6% of those psychologists identified as conservative, and especially on social topics, only 3.9% did. And interestingly, that was a significant underestimation of conservatives amongst colleagues, or perceived underestimation of an underestimation of perceived conservatives amongst colleagues. And so they did find support, though, that of the fear that conservatives are being discriminated against. And they essentially surveyed on a 7-point Likert scale the likelihood or willingness to discriminate according to paper, grant, and symposium. Paper and grant reviews and symposium invitations, as well as hiring decisions. And they included anything over 4 on that 7-point Likert scale as sort of indicative of willingness to discriminate. I would argue anything over 1, even if fairly low, is still willingness to discriminate. So these percentages could be even higher for that matter. And so it was a pretty revealing study, but I'd like to include one other follow-up study related to this one, was that by Honeycutt and Freeberg in 2017. They surveyed academics outside of psychology as well, over 2,000 academics across 79 disciplines, and found support of the ideological conflict hypothesis, essentially that the willingness to discriminate on ideological lines is equal across the political spectrum. So this is not something that's unique to liberals or those left of center, but the willingness to discriminate against the ideological outgroup is present no matter what. It just so happens that, at least in psychology, the profession is comprised largely of liberals, and therefore conservatives are more likely to face discrimination. Now, I'm going to shift to a few topic areas. The first is that of authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is has been in the research for a long time. It was first introduced by researchers like Altmaier and Jost. The reason this is maybe a little bit more of a hot button topic is because they tended to exclusively conflate conservative traits and policy positions with authoritarian related characteristics. Other related topics have included symbolic racism, system justification, and social dominance theories. And essentially, up until very recently, they not only studied authoritarianism, but also labeled it right-wing authoritarianism, really indicating that this was a phenomenon solely on the right side of the political aisle. And it was understood according to three traits, the tripartite model, which included submission, conventionalism, and aggression. And really, this has been sort of the gold standard in terms of conceptualizing authoritarianism. Now, what happened here is a researcher in 2018, Conway, published a study in which he challenged this. He thought, well, not so fast, even though authoritarianism outside of the right wing has been dubbed the Loch Ness Monster. In other words, it doesn't exist. He wanted to verify this, and what he did was he rewrote the RWA scale and made a point to sort of adjust the wording to feature left-wing issues and concerns in a way that Altmaier had not done in the past, therefore never identifying authoritarianism left of center. He sort of identified this as a point of comparison. It's like using only a male sample to gather data about a disorder and then perceiving a sex difference related to that disorder. And so Conway did a few things. He rewrote the RWA scale, and he gave that in a survey to university students, as well as the new left-wing authoritarianism measure and measures of ideology and domains of prejudice, dogmatism, and attitude strength. And he found positive correlations between left-wing authoritarianism and all three domains listed here, and found significant effect sizes. Then he did the study again, essentially administered the same surveys to the general population, which also hadn't been done in previous research. Previous studies had only looked at university students, and he found similar effect sizes there as well. The findings of his study were later kind of confirmed again in 2020. And one thing that I found particularly interesting about this was it connected again with my training. During my doctoral internship, I attended a seminar in which the presiding training psychologist spoke to us about authoritarianism, and especially right-wing authoritarianism, and perpetuated the notion that this is almost one and the same with right-wing values or traditional values. And so I could see even this contrary research was not included. And so here's just another slide where you can see some of the graphs in the publication showing a very similar mirroring between right-wing and left-wing authoritarianism. There's one other study similar to this, but a little bit more involved in just last year by Costello and his colleagues. And they essentially did a few things as well. He challenged the notion of ideology inertia, which he believed perpetuated the current authoritarianism models. And he said, the dominant view of RWA as the gold standard of authoritarianism writ large is not merely an influential theoretical framework or a historical quirk. It limits the questions we ask as scientists, the methods we employ to answer those questions, and the types of theories we use to interpret our results. as such, the nearly universal exclusion of left-wing features from conceptualizations of authoritarianism, with little consideration of LWA and RWA's psychological commonalities, has limited the kinds of knowledge we can produce as psychological scientists. In the study, they avoided that tripartite conceptualization and instead sort of expanded upon the personality and cognitive styles that could explain authoritarianism. And so they looked at over 60 traits, and they accounted for political ideology, eliminated items, controlling variables, and they also included other behavioral indicators of authoritarianism. And what they found was LWA correlated less with dogmatism and cognitive rigidity, but more with negative emotionality, support for a political system with substantial centralized state control. And they found that it predicted behavioral aggression and political violence, and was best characterized according to three primary dimensions: anti-hierarchical aggression, top-down censorship, and anti-conventionalism. But perhaps the most useful thing that came out of this study was honing in on what the heart of authoritarianism is, regardless of which end of the political spectrum one would find it. And that included preference for social uniformity, prejudice towards different others, willingness to wield group authority to coerce behavior, cognitive rigidity, aggression, and punitiveness towards perceived enemies, outside concern for hierarchy and moral absolutism. And what was very interesting about this too is, you think, well, so what? The study, corrected wrongs or errors in previous research. Well, the authors noted that the citation rates show little self-correction. So if you search on Google Scholar for right-wing authoritarianism, you'll find close to 13,000 results. But if you search for left-wing authoritarianism, and granted it is a newer construct, you still only find under or just over 600 results. And the first paper is titled "The Myth of Left-Wing Authoritarianism." So it is taking a long time, I would say, for not only for self-correction to take place in science, but also for this to become more widely understood when those corrections happen. And I'll show you a couple graphs from the study that are interesting to see. So this is a comparison of left-wing authoritarianism with the authoritarianism composite. And then here too, you can see essentially a very similar pattern between right-wing and left-wing authoritarianism, where up at the top, most of these traits, either personality traits or cognitive styles, are very closely overlapping and gradually become a little bit differentiated. And the authors explain that while there is considerable overlap, ultimately each have unique flavors. So now I'm going to shift gears to talk about microaggressions. I'm sure this is a topic that comes up frequently in multicultural courses and trainings, but not exclusively so. It's a term that also is related to terms such as symbolic and modern racisms, which really imply more implicit prejudices. And Scott Lilienfeld published a fairly comprehensive review about the limitations of microaggressions. And he said that microaggression research programs have been marked by an absence of connectivity to key domains in psychological science, including psychometrics, social cognition, CBT, behavior genetics, and personality, health, and industrial psychology, or industrial organizational psychology. And he refuted the 5 core premises that he identified within microaggression research and argued that the term is conceptually and methodologically underdeveloped. And he identified this primarily with pertaining to logical clarity and coherence of the construct, reliability, criterion related validity, incremental validity, and as well as difficulty with replicability of findings across diverse information sources, especially independent observers, and kind of getting at that sort of eye of the beholder problem that involves inferring meaning and intention, as well as sort of convoluting what the exact scope would be of what constitutes a microaggression. And he kind of highlighted the sort of contradictory nature of microaggression items. Certain ones, for instance, are contradictory insofar as, for instance, like both withholding and providing criticism could be microaggressive. He also sort of identified the sort of inherent or implied human behavior model that was being used in microaggression research, which was that of the stimulus response model, which he explains has particular shortcomings relative to a cognitive or transactional model of human behavior, which argues that people respond to the environmental stimuli according to their traits, states, personality, dispositions, and degree of identification with minority group status. And so without sort of accounting for those individual differences, we're not seeing the full picture. He also argued about the problems with monosource bias, ideological bias blind spot, and hostile attribution bias, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with from maybe training in social psychology. And he offers 18 very comprehensive recommendations for microaggression research programs and discusses the significant considerations for current corporate and educational practices, which is extremely relevant. He cites that one estimate has placed the cost of microaggressions to the US workplace productivity at between $450 to $500 billion per year. I mean, that's a colossal amount of money for a construct that, you know, at best is debatable, or perhaps underdeveloped. And there's been other concerns too that you may be aware of pertaining to indicators that racial sensitivity trainings, which largely comprise considerable microaggression content, has had unintended consequences such as fomenting racial stereotypes, decreasing sense of workplace unity or team cohesion, among others. So one additional study kind of related to the topic of implicit bias or symbolic racism, for instance, would be that of the IAT. One of the hallmark studies on that topic is Oswald et al. In 2013. And the IAT, if you are unfamiliar, is the most commonly used implicit measure intended to predict real-world discrimination among other behaviors, from self-injury to consumer product preferences. And you can see in the top corner there a little graph of what the IAT for ethnicity or race might look like. And I won't explain sort of the details of the test. I think most people are generally familiar with it, and it's something you could look up after if you are not. But essentially what Oswald and his colleagues did was a very large meta-analysis in response to the IAT proponents' 2009 meta-analysis. And they looked at the heterogeneity of effects within and across 2 domains of intergroup bias, 6 criterion categories, 2 versions of the IAT, 3 strategies for measuring explicit bias, and 4 criterion scoring methods. And what they found was that it was by and large a very poor predictor of any of the criterions except for brain activity. And the authors explained, in the absence of an outward verbal or nonverbal behavior, the correlation of the IAT and brain behavior does not provide much useful information. And so the authors also described that many of the studies examined in theirs relied on published, theoretically grounded measures of bias, including measures designed to assess modern racism, symbolic racism, and ambivalent racism. Yet these published, validated inventories fared no better than simple feeling thermometers or ad hoc instruments created by researchers. And one potential reason why the more theoretically grounded instruments came up short is that they, like the IAT, seek to measure prejudicial attitudes indirectly and seek to capture subterranean racist motivations that can be hard to separate from non-racial motivations behind support for or opposition to various political policies. So once again, a little bit of that conflation taking place or unable to rule out. And ultimately, they found that the IAT was simply a no better predictor of, say, discrimination than explicit measures of racism. The IAT developers conducted another major meta-analysis in 2018, because you might be wondering if what is more current than this. But critics have found that this study was also methodologically flawed in similar ways. And Shimek, from his publication last year, also found support for this 2013 study. So at least to say this has been a back and forth process. But one thing I would suggest those listening to do too is research this separately or at a later time, and also look at the responses from the IAT's proponents, such as Greenwald and Banaji, because others have sort of remarked on their general attitudes or response to criticism as being sort of counterproductive. I'm going to shift gears now to the topic of personality and gender differences, or sex-based differences. I do understand that this is a little bit contentious, but it's important to know what this research has found. The Schmidt et al. 2017 study is a very large review of many studies, with some similarity in authorship, but not entirely. They looked at many different countries and reviewed the following traits that you see here: the big 5 traits, dark triad traits, self-esteem, subjective well-being, romantic attitudes, even physical traits such as height, obesity, and blood pressure. And they found, interestingly enough, and much to their surprise, that differences are conspicuously larger in cultures with more egalitarian gender roles, gender socialization, and sociopolitical gender equity. And so, for instance, I include as an example here in the big 5 traits, they looked at 55 different countries and found a substantial difference in effect sizes. So France at 0.44 and India at 0.01, for instance. And that is sort of a good example of patterns that they found across different traits and countries. And ultimately, they found that this sort of established more support for evolutionary theories about sex differences, but also corresponding results to other studies looking at sex-based differences in infants less than even approximately at 5 months old and across species. But it's important to note, and the authors are very clear about this, that within group differences are still greater than between group differences. Nonetheless, the population differences have implications at broad levels. For instance, criminal justice, aggression, violence, career interests, work-life decision-making, risk-taking behavior, etc. And when I was doing my own research, I was spending a little bit of time working my way around the American Psychological Association website and saw that they expressly state on the topic of sex differences that sex differences, and I quote, are myths perpetuated by media, obviously despite really compelling research and decades of research to indicate differently. So there's a significant disparity in some very strong and compelling research and what professional organizations are claiming. And I'll spend one more slide looking at sex differences because I found that this sort of added to the previous. Robertson et al. 2010 and Lubinsky 2020. I included these together as Lubinsky was an author on both articles and they're related in topic, but essentially what they did was conducted longitudinal studies, and actually a series of studies, and these publications covered them, but longitudinal studies of high-performing adolescents and pretty substantial sample sizes as well. And they found that ability level predicts the level of achievement in one's career, and ability pattern, meaning sort of the makeup of cognitive abilities across math, verbal, and spatial skills, predicts the realm of achievement. And they said that adding information on vocational interests refines prediction of educational and career choices. Lifestyle preferences relevant to career choice, performance, and persistence often change between ages 25 and 35. You might imagine why that could be. This change results in sex differences in preferences, which likely have relevance for understanding the underrepresentation of women in careers that demand more than a full-time, 40 hours per week commitment. And they found in terms of those differences in career interests that the difference could really be understood as the interest difference in people versus things professions, or organic versus inorganic. And lastly, this was an interesting thing that they also provided support for. Evidence suggests that women are pleased with their choices. For example, women receive around 68% of doctorates in education, over 70% in health and medical sciences, and over 75% in public administrative services. If mathematically gifted women are more likely to secure JDs or PhDs in epidemiology as opposed to inorganic science relative to their male counterparts, is this problematic? If a mathematically gifted woman with expertise in environmental law rescues some precious land in Alaska from polluting exploitation, is that less of a contribution than a male counterpart who advances knowledge of the physical universe? So I think it's important to keep in mind, the study from the previous slide that accounts for the socio-cultural influence, in essence, that egalitarian societies evidence an increase in sex-based differences, essentially, and egalitarian society allows for the pursuit of personal interest in accordance with aptitudes, and thus that reveals greater sex differences. So I'm going to shift gears once again and talk a little bit more about clinical research or in clinical work. The last study I'd like to highlight in this section is that of Richard Redding from 2020, and he conducted a really comprehensive review of the considerations of sociopolitical values in psychotherapy, which I know will be of interest to many of you, and I do highly recommend reading his publication. He looked at both a sample of practicing clinicians as well as just general population Americans through Mechanical Turk who had completed at least 5 sessions of psychotherapy during the past 5 years. And he found that he discussed at least the benefit of sociopolitical value similarities between clinician and client and the threat of differences to the therapeutic relationship, and discussed what it would mean to pursue sociopolitical competency. And he provides a number of recommendations that you can see here. But one piece of research from it that I thought was very interesting and worthwhile sharing is in the box here on the side. He says that although there were modest positive correlations between thinking it appropriate to challenge the client's SPVs and the view that knowing the client's SPVs improved problem conceptualization and treatment approach, it was also correlated with the potential to negatively affect the therapeutic relationship and to bias diagnosis. And on the second slide here, I just included some quoted content from his article showing some of the thought processes of clients and clinicians when it comes to sociopolitical value differences. And I think these are important to really get a sense for what these differences can mean and imply in that psychotherapeutic milieu. One person said, here, by some of what she said, her body posture and the way she said what she said, it became very clear to me that my beliefs and thus me were the epitome of everything she was raised to think of as wrong. Her demeanor took on a coldness after this exchange. Another clinician here comments on perceived countertransference. And I'll just give you a moment to scan over those. Okay. So let's talk about professional applications. And this is the last section of my presentation. First, and really before proceeding, it's always judicious to start with discussion about professional ethics. And I did a side-by-side here of the APA versus CPA Code of Ethics to give a sense for relevant general principles and domains or standards. Both codes of ethics are organized a little bit differently, but I tried to capture the ones that I felt were most relevant. Specifically, the domains and standards are selected ones. When it comes to the topic of competence, one could argue that it is important to have the ability to serve sociopolitically diverse people. From a human relations standpoint, thinking of informed consent and avoiding exploitation, minimizing harm, of course, accuracy and honesty in one's professional practice, especially with regard to research and representing findings accurately, assessment and therapy when thinking of assessment results, interpreting results, and terminating therapy, for instance. And I would argue, too, that it's important to seek consultation when one feels challenged to provide the services that they perceive as important or needed, and to ensure protection of any and all clients one is serving, and to promote self-awareness. And I'd like to include a little bit of commentary here about methods for reducing bias in research. So some of you may be pursuing a career in research, in which case this is particularly relevant. And for those who prefer to pursue clinical work, it's still important to be able to digest research well and to review it critically and to be able to look for certain things like these. But before I get into that list, Philip Tetlock, in way back 1994 said, "I believe that if we fail as to institutionalize checks over on the over-politicization of political psychological knowledge, most importantly, rigorous and even-handed peer review, we sacrifice our collective credibility as a science. We become just one more partisan voice clamoring for media attention." I can't say that sounds particularly appealing, being in a scientific profession. So, suggested here, one is to ensure falsifiability of one's theories. If it cannot be falsified, it's not a good theory. To apply counterfactuals, which could be understood as sort of questions to unpack a hypothesis. For instance, have you applied the same standards of evidence to theory consistent and theory challenging counterfactuals? Identifying counterexamples in research. So if some studies indicate one finding, is it possible to find other studies coming to opposing conclusions or challenging the conclusions in the initial set of studies? Addressing the questionable interpretive practices, which are known as double standards, intentional or unintentional blind spots, embedded values. And there's some suggestions here about what can be done to mitigate those QIPs. For instance, meta-analyses for blind spots, turnabout tests for double standards. A turnabout test essentially involves putting the shoe on the other foot. And then also a priori hypotheses versus post hoc rationalizations. And other ones, including ensuring that data is available for other researchers to utilize, engaging in adversarial collaborations in research, so intentionally seeking out people with differing perspectives to strengthen a research study, replicating findings as much as possible, which goes hand in hand with the concerns pertaining to the replication crisis, and attending to allegiance effects and publication bias, which are maybe less pertinent to this specific topic, but still important to consider. In my study, co-authored study in 2020, it was really a commentary, a review on a lot of these topics, but really getting into the clinical implications, but across multiple areas of clinical processes, from applications to graduate school, internship, education and supervision, as well as psychotherapy. And my colleagues and I sort of unpacked related concerns such as the competing schools of thought about values-laden versus values-free frameworks, the significance of the therapeutic relationship, and some of the research showing that theoretical orientation and political ideology correlate. And I really wanted to make a point about identifying the counter-arguments to this as being an important area of study or of professional concern, and addressed those concerns with a rebuttal, and ultimately wanted to identify some solutions to really center patient needs versus therapist agenda, identify guiding principles from professional ethics and multicultural competency guidelines, and so on. one of the most useful resources I think exists as far as navigating ideological or values differences in clinical work is that of the moral foundations theory, which was developed by Jonathan Haidt. And I pulled one of those studies in particular to provide a little bit of context and as an example. They described how typical moral philosophy focuses on individualizing features, essentially how to protect the individual, but doesn't account for nuances across certain groups. For instance, Western conservatives and certain international cultures. And they identified certain groups in India and Brazil as examples. And so Graham, Haidt, and Nosek looked at over 1,600 participants surveyed through their project and accounted for what they called both individualizing and binding distinctions, which really pertain to the locus of moral value, whether that was at the individual or group level, which was a little bit more comprehensive and added depth in a way that other approaches maybe didn't account for. And essentially they boiled it down to 5 moral foundations that were applicable to everyone but weighted differently according to political ideology. Eventually they did find a 6th foundation to liberty versus oppression. But as you can see in this chart, there's a notable difference between, say, a very liberal and a very conservative individual in terms of those underlying moral foundations. And it's not that they're different, they're just weighted differently. And when we can start to really delve into what that would look like, it becomes easier to understand why other people think and feel differently about important cultural or social topics. And so if you want, you can also go onto their website and take the self-assessment, which is an interesting experience. And I include a reference here about how Christopher Rosick applied moral foundations theory to discussion about traditional versus same-sex views of marriage, which, albeit is a sensitive topic, but the application of the moral foundations theory was done very thoughtfully and helped to provide a deeper understanding related to clinical practice. And in some subsequent studies, Graham, Haidt, and Nosek said the following. In 2012, they looked at over 2,000 US participants who filled out the Moral Foundations questionnaire. And they said, while estimations of direction of differences in foundations were accurate, they were exaggerated. Contrary to common theories of stereotyping, the moral stereotypes were not simply underestimations of the political outgroup's morality. Both liberals and conservatives exaggerated the ideological extremity of moral concerns for the in-group as well as the out-group. And interestingly, liberals were least accurate about both groups. And they provided an example that Democrats underestimated the effect size of Republican support for public education and programs designed to reduce inequality. And as you can imagine, generally speaking, exaggerations tend to be uncharitable. So a current project that I am working on with Richard Redding, we hope to publish sometime this year. We are developing a provisional set of sociopolitical diversity competency guidelines. To do this, we are hosting a short series of focus groups. We're seeking about 25 to 30 diverse expert, academic, and applied psychologists. And I use the phrase expert loosely because there's not too many people in psychology, regardless of which area specifically, for whom this is an expert topic, but we are seeking out people who are particularly interested in this subject matter and understand the need for it. And we have categorized guidelines according to these 6 domains. And on the side here, I just included a couple examples of what those are looking like. We also discussed the challenges with previous multicultural guidelines, the significance of sociopolitical values as an area of diversity. Each of the guidelines includes rationale and application, and really the purpose is to help sort of promote the desire to steel man versus straw man and out-group members' perspective for the purpose of sort of enhancing one's professional practice. These are a few of the challenges that have come up, though, or things that I've been thinking about that I wanted to share with you. One pertains to the issue of truth. There's considerable debate about whether truth is objective and can be known versus a relative or subjective phenomena. And we sort of can feel that tension, for instance, between knowing that practicing good science is important and adhering to the scientific method, but also calls to recognize people's lived experience, for instance. Self-disclosure, I think, is a very challenging thing to navigate in clinical settings, especially in psychotherapy. So I'm wondering about when is it appropriate to disclose that, for what purpose would one do so? Another area is that of conscience clauses. So it's interesting that the APA strongly opposes conscience clauses, but is there value in finding a way to preserve rights of clients and clinicians alike? Similarly, I mentioned earlier that there's an increasing pattern of prospective therapy clients seeking out sympathetic practitioners or therapists, but to meet that need, there is a growing subculture in the profession of politically identifying practitioners, and I wonder about what the precedent of that is or what the implications would be. And does that sort of undermine our obligation to be able to serve most people in general? And the last one is that of the tension between science and activism. I think a strong case can be made that these are incompatible tasks or roles. And in part making that case is Tutlock again from 1994. He said, "Am I advocating for political celibacy? Another misunderstanding of my argument is that political psychologists should abstain from policy controversies in general. Nothing could be further from the truth. The research community possesses the knowledge of cause and effect relations and analytical skills that can prove valuable in a wide range of policy controversies, from affirmative action to daycare to international negotiations to taxation. The question is, in what capacity do we enter such controversies? Do we blur the roles of scientist, whose aim is truth, and advocate, whose aim is justice? Or do we attempt some separation of roles? My view is that of Koshland, the editor of Science, who says scientists are the servants of society, not its masters, and we should remain so. We serve neither science nor society well when we accidentally or intentionally smuggle our political values into our research findings." And granted, this quote pertains somewhat more to political psychology, but I think it has relevance towards other areas of social and clinical psychology as well. And for clinical psychology, it's interesting to give some thought to what the potential implications, positive or negative, could be of clinical psychologists taking on activist roles, and if and what any boundaries should be. Okay, so here are my references. And I will turn this over to back to our host, and I'm happy to take any questions. I will say, I think many of you will receive my recommended readings list after this talk, and many of the studies that I discuss are included there, among others as well, and I'm happy to provide a more comprehensive reading list by request.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Silander. So I see a few questions are starting to pop in. Everybody, if you see at the bottom of your screen, there will be a Q&A tab. If you click that and type in your question, it'll come to Dr. Silander and I. And Dr. Silander, if you click that tab right now, you'll see 4 questions have popped up. All you have to do is pick the question you want to answer, hit the button that says answer live, and that question will show up for the people on the screen so they can all see the question as well. So
Okay.
I'll let you pick whatever order you wish to answer the questions or just address the comments. Yeah, so feel free, please send your questions away.
Okay, so the first...
If you want, I can do this if you like. What do you prefer?
Oh, I have them pulled up. At
Great.
first, I accidentally opened the chat and not the Q&A, but I have the questions now. So the first one, do you think the self-correction needed in psychology to reduce the ideological bias will happen from within or through persuasive arguments like yours? Or will it take larger outside pressure from, say, the government? I mean, I would hope it could happen from within. I mean, that would certainly be my preference. I think, one thing we know from social psychology is that concept of psychological reactance, and sometimes for programs or people being obligated to make adjustments because of an outside source would cause resentment or resistance. And I think any sort of change or drive to correct ideological bias happening from within will be longer lasting, more meaningful, and if people are motivated to do that intrinsically, that would be a much more valuable thing to have happen. But will it happen? I don't know. I mean, I hope so.
Great. Next one's not a question, so how about I just take this one, just read it out. It's not really a question here. I do not have a question, but I want to say thank you very much to the speaker and the organizer for this very informative talk. Absolutely excellent. So,
thank you. Okay, the next question. Okay. Do I think that the Graham et al. 2009 findings, which seem to be in line with right-wing authoritarianism research, seeing the right as reinforcing the power of authority, right, are biased in a similar way to the right-wing authoritarianism being biased due to having similar findings across these two? Also, how do these findings line up with our contemporary COVID-related issues, where the left is typically more concerned about purity, in essence, people not being vaccinated, and the right seems to be anti-authority, concerned with overreach of vaccine mandates? That would take me a little while to sort of digest that question, but I do recall reading a publication article, like a news article or magazine article not so long ago, trying to better understand why it's sort of the way that the political parties or conservative and liberals have responded to the pandemic would be unpredictable or kind of surprising based on pre-existing understandings of what motivates them. For instance, conservatives are thought to be like more disgust sensitive or threat responsive, and therefore like the sort of more lackadaisical reaction to the pandemic is confusing. I don't remember all the reasons for why that was explained to be the case, but I think it does show the sort of complexity of the of what it means to be liberal and to be conservative, that these are really multidimensional constructs. So, for instance, a conservative individual can be both concerned about the sort of almost philosophical issues associated with open borders, but also very concerned about individual freedoms. And it depends if you're looking at more authoritarian personalities versus more libertarian personalities that can exist under the broader heading of conservative, for instance. So I realize I'm not answering your question entirely, but I think that's the best I can do on the fly right now.
Great, thank you. Keep sending your questions in.
Yes. And so this one is, what is the impact of CPA versus or APA's increasing focus on social justice orientation as part of its understanding of ethical practice on the ability to engage effectively with ideological diversity? I think that probably remains to be seen. I suppose one answer I have is that the calls for social justice really seem to promote social activism, and I'm concerned about that. It really does promote political activism, and for the reasons described in that Tetlock quote is that to be adhering to science means you're seeking the truth regardless of where it leaves you, because the truth is inherently a good thing, and that's the mission of the scientist. Whereas to be called to social justice and political activism means that you are seeking to advance a particular end or a particular agenda, and it doesn't even have to, it's not about whether it's a good or a bad thing, but the purpose and the mission is very different from that of science. And I do think that the term social justice is also politically loaded, and so it can be alienating, and it does sort of require, for instance, APA to do this requires its members to sort of adopt a similar ideological perspective that doesn't account for people's ranging perspectives on what justice is, for instance. Okay. What are the limits of viewpoint diversity? In other words, are there any sociopolitical views that you think should not be seriously considered within psychological practice, research, or theory? Relatedly, what are your thoughts on cultural relativism? I think the limits of viewpoint diversity, I mean, I'd have to spend some time really thinking about that too, so I don't want to answer that too flippantly, but I suppose the limit would be at times viewpoints that could really interfere with the fundamental scientific nature of psychology. That would be of concern to mine, or to me. But I do understand that there are different schools of thought on that. I would suppose that there perhaps are not too many. Ultimately, to allow a variety of viewpoints to exist allows those viewpoints to be challenged. And ultimately, that's a positive thing. That's what allows different hypotheses to be tested. That's what allows for different topics to be studied in research. Similarly, in clinical practice, you can't escape it. So that is already pretty expansive in terms of professional roles and work. what are your thoughts on cultural relativism? Oh, that's such a big question. I kind of hesitate to answer that. I suspect there are some cultural practices that can be very harmful. What you make of that and what conclusions you draw are a whole other thing to discuss. That's a very difficult question. I mean, that could take a whole afternoon to discuss. I see that there's another question related to the one I was just answering. To build on that question, do we need to hear another perspective on the notion that the Holocaust occurred and was immoral? I mean, I don't know if that's a scientific question or what role that would have in psychology, for instance. I mean, maybe one would want to know why people come to believe that from a psychological standpoint. I mean, that does sort of go into the whole area of conspiracy theories. And there's a whole psychological research domain dedicated to that. Psychology training has emphasized a traditional post-positive paradigm in science. I'm curious what your views on qualitative research, for instance, based on constructivist paradigms, where subjectivity is inherent in the research process, or critical paradigms, which has an explicit focus on empowerment and change. Well, I am not familiar with what post-positive paradigms are, and I think I may know what critical paradigms are, but I hesitate to sort of answer that question. But when it comes to sort of going the route of qualitative research, I think qualitative research certainly has tremendous value in sort of opening up different areas of research, but in the absence of quantitative research, there's significant limitations to the extent that conclusions can be generalized. And so I think we still have an obligation as a profession to put our hypotheses to the test. And yeah, I think that's kind of how I'd answer that. Alternative ways of knowing, whether it's religious or indigenous, are kind of an entire other can of worms. In light of the findings you discussed related to career decisions in more egalitarian countries, do you have one or two suggestions for how our universities or even primary and secondary schools might do a better job of facilitating young people's career interests? I think just making sure the opportunities are available to students, no matter what level of education they're currently in, is the most important thing. If there are certain barriers at times, whether it's financial, prejudicial, or other, we want to remove those obstacles. But otherwise, I mean, it's a beautiful thing to allow people to pursue what they would like. And I think the more egalitarian countries are, it would appear, are allowing that, and therefore we're seeing these differences. So I think just making sure those opportunities are available. And how that's done is an entirely different question. Another question: I work in higher education, and I am wondering what your thoughts might be for an institution such as mine, which is increasingly moving in the direction of emphasis on social justice as a fundamental value or function of the institution, but which also has robust psychology and counseling programs. How might someone like me advocate for gently probing leadership to consider arguably the incompatible natures of social justice and pursuit of truth, to pull from Jonathan Haidt? I mean, that's sort of a million-dollar question, I suppose. I mean, I would probably try to seek out any in administration or leadership who might be receptive to that conversation, and bring relevant resources or reading to discuss that, and to get into some of the implications for what it could mean when these two directions unfold in their respective ways. I suspect the Heterodox Academy likely has some resources related to that. I know other organizations or professional groups such as Society for Open Inquiry of Behavioral Sciences may be resources as well. I suppose a fallback could always be to ensure that the risks of pursuing an activist agenda under the heading of social justice without the science to support the mission could have really detrimental impacts. And so that might, being motivated out of concern for that, might be one in for that conversation.
Great. Dr. Silander, we have a question from Ishu Ishiyama, who is the emergency backup co-host and cannot post.
Yeah.
So I'll read out his question to you if that's okay.
Okay.
Okay. So again, it's from Dr. Ishu Ishiyama. You mentioned transference and countertransference in your presentation. In the case of political transference or countertransference, e.g., liberal versus conservative belief and positions, between the therapist and the client, which could impede open communication and the level of trust in the helping relationship, what advice or recommendation would you offer to clinicians in such cases?
This is where I think having sort of a humble disposition, kind of similar to what is recommended by proponents of the multicultural orientation model, would suggest that's a really helpful thing to realize, that one really needs to maintain a certain posture and attitude which is flexible and responsive, as opposed to necessarily achieving particular skill sets to navigate that. But another way I might answer that is to say to, I mentioned this in one of my slides, but to steel man versus straw man another person's perspective. And so if you think about a social topic or a political perspective that you really dislike or disagree with, recall maybe what it would have been like in primary or elementary school to have been on a debate team, or in high school or secondary school to be on a debate team and needing to, as best as you can, represent another person's viewpoints, even if you disagree with them, to think of the strongest arguments and to go into those interactions with a client you disagree with the understanding that they possess the views and the values they have for particular reasons, and some of them could be quite powerful or compelling. That helps you be humble, and I think that's really important. And to understand the moral foundations that can underpin another person's viewpoint. That's another really important approach and understanding.
Great. That takes us to the end of our time here. We did have one more question, so I'm going to encourage that person to, I put the link here in the chat again, to stick around if they want to talk about their question in small groups. Dr. Silander, it was such a pleasure to hear you speak and present some ideas and some research findings that I suspect are not in the awareness of many people who attended the talk. So thank you so much on behalf of myself and my research lab, the Counseling Psychology program at the University of British Columbia, and the Heterodox Academy. And for those in attendance still, if you would like to stick around, either copy and paste that link in the chat, or perhaps it'll take you there directly when you close the webinar. We're opening up a Zoom meeting room for people who'd like to have small group discussion about the talk today. And Dr. Silander, I know you have other responsibilities and it is at the end of the workday, but you're welcome to stick around, but I also understand if you have to. Everybody else, thank you so much for being here today, and I look forward to seeing some people in the post-discussion or post-talk chat. Bye-bye, and the meeting room for the chat will open up in about 30 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you.